Welcome and thanks. I would like to first thank Museum Sush and Agnieszka and Lisbeth for the invitation to take part in this symposium and write in the catalog. It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to engage with the work of Tapta and with this beautiful exhibition. So today I'm going to present a talk based on the essay that I have published in the exhibition's catalog. By 1960, when Tapta returned to Belgium after spending a decade in Congo, informalist abstraction was still at its peak. Indeed, no previous artistic tendency had ever enjoyed such worldwide success. Tapta was by no means an informalist, and nothing in her interviews suggests that she was particularly interested in the tendency. But its influential pictorial model does resonate in her work nevertheless. After all, informalism was not merely about flaunting gestures and marks that originated from an overblown subject. It was also about deepening and complicating the sheer materiality of the painted surface. Sometimes for the sake of its own tragic density, sometimes in order to embed symbols that presided over its painterly thickness, as in the paintings, for example, of the Catalan cousins, Antoni Tapis and Modest Quixart. To be sure, Tapta's exploration of the woven matrix of her mural textiles was technically very diverse from the informalist handling of paint. But various procedures she introduced in order to claim distance from traditional pieces of tapestry do suggest relevant parallels, especially as she sought to explore and heighten the expressivity of the medium. As Virginie Mamet has pointed out, Tapta strove to make each fiber visible and dyed the fibers herself in order to achieve the precise hues she wanted. She also experimented with rapid gestures and, in wall fabric number 2, with interspersing heterogeneous materials like copper plates into the fabric. Looser, unwoven parts simultaneously underscore the materiality of the fiber itself and install a dialectic of openness and closure that give organic overtones to forms like the central element in wall fabric number 2, an ovoid shape not unlike some of Quixart's. As Tapta gradually moved towards sculptural works like Cocoon number 1, she further engaged in this dialectic. Hung in the air, the work is palpably subjected to the force of gravity, which puts the suppleness of its cotton cords to test, enacting a tension that is resolved figuratively in the erotically charged creases and folds. In Falling Knots, in turn, gravity functions as the background against which the temporality of making comes to the fore, as wool, linen, and cotton cords are strung together in various knots that brush against each other, rendering tangible the weight that pulls down cords while simultaneously resisting it via the visible work that goes into tying and suspending them. The knots are obviously the product of a kind of repetitive manual labor that verges on pointlessness. The work doesn't result in a proper composition, as one might expect from a piece of tapestry, but this is precisely what allows us to perceive that each knot works through the thickness and pliability of the materials in a unique way. While its overall format remains that of the mural textiles, the very fact that Falling Knots has been occasionally hung away from the wall suggests that it is perceived first and foremost as a sculpture. And it was precisely by working through the sculptural, by questioning, and I quote from Tapta, traditional ways of using textiles, that Tapta arrived at the threshold of environmentality. According to art historian Christine Mary, the late 60s were marked by an European euphoria for environments. That is, for artworks that, I quote, literally encircle their viewers, end quote. This understanding of environmentality derived largely from the North American artist Alan Caprow, who used the term to designate, I quote again, an art that filled entire containing areas, nearly obliterating the rule definition of the rooms and that incorporated the spectator as an important physical component, end quote. Clearly enough, forms for a flexible space is consistent with such definitions. An often reproduced image in Tapta's archives shows the artist and other participants seated together in a cavernous photographic rendering of the work. Both the proliferation of rope discs above and the masses of lying ropes below unsettle our apprehension of the room in which the work was installed. Both the ceiling and the floor are almost entirely hidden from sight. On closer inspection, a thin white wire running vertically near the artist indicates that the work is possibly installed near the corner of the room, but the wire is rather hard to discern amidst so many dangling ropes. Indeed, the only unmistakable element of the architecture, namely the wall in the back, is absorbed into the work's visual maelstrom as it becomes a screen for a convoluted shadow theater of bodies and cords. The faces of Tapta and her companions are all veiled in one way or another, by either their hands, by shadows, by excessive exposure, or by the ropes themselves, so that our focus is further unsettled and decentered. It may be that the camera's flashlight heightened the effect, but the work's Baroque profusion of torsions and coils brings light and shadow into a similar play in other conditions of illumination as well. In a series of photographs taken at Beaux-Arts, for example, photographer Philippe de Gobert clearly attempted to capture the changing slivers of light coming from either the building's skylight, that the upper coils partially let through, or from spotlights installed on the floor. Neither the meaning nor the historical purchase of environment as an artistic category in the 1960s were a straightforward affair. Fluxus artists, on the one hand, would often turn to happenings and environmental manifestations as a means to parade not only their rejection of artistic conventions, but also their critical stance towards an emerging commodity culture that increasingly colonized and threatened to stultify the everyday. Their strategy had little to do with expanding or overcoming either painting or sculpture. Instead, its roots trace back to Dada antics and to the surrealist object. On the other hand, and in a reminder that such environmental euphoria was by no means a strictly European phenomenon, the Brazilian artist Hélio Oiticica forcefully theorized the gist of his post-neo-concrete production in the 1960s under the umbrella of a so-called environmental program, that had its cornerstone in the parangolas, the capes and tents participants were meant to wear or hold while dancing, often collectively. Tapta and former neo-concretists such as Oiticica, Lydia Clark, and Lydia Pape were almost certainly unaware of each other, and for all its technical eclecticism and awareness of the applied arts tradition of the Bauhaus, no neo-concretist has ever engaged with textile art. Oiticica and Clark used fabric in various ways, including, of course, the parangolas. But the point remains that they never resorted to fabrics or to the technique of weaving as constituent parts of a medium. Lydia Pape, in turn, titled an important series of woodcut prints tesselares or weavings, but the reference to weaving in these works is metaphorical. However, there are a couple of points of convergence, or rather affinity, between those very different sets of practices that are worth taking into consideration. Michael Watson has listed a series of characteristics of Alexander Calder's stabiles and mobiles that Tapta identified with, such as their ingenious articulations, the way they entice participation, and their dynamic balance, among others. I believe that looking at Calder from the perspective of neo-concretism offers additional insight into how he might have also contributed to the environmental direction that Tapta's work embraced. Despite being one of the most popular modern American artists, Calder remains largely marginalized in serious Anglophone art historical accounts, or more precisely, in art histories that follow from Grimbergian modernism or from the post-structuralism turn of the October generation of critics and art historians, for whom Calder's work was either too facile, as opposed to modern sculpture, or overly tied to anthropomorphism, as opposed to minimalist and post-minimalist sculpture. The rise of constructive abstraction in Brazil tells a different story, though. Championed first by modernist architects and then by critic Mário Pedrosa, the most influential critical voice in Brazilian post-war debates, Calder's work drew interest also for their proto-environmental effect, that is, for the way their movement involved and activated their surroundings. When Calder's work was exhibited at the Museu de Arte de São Paulo, for instance, the museum directors Pietro Maria Bardi and his wife and collaborator, the architect Lina Bobardi, designed an exhibition setting that included directed lighting, variously colored panels, and electric fans to steer the mobiles. Additionally, the fact that Tapta actually declared her interest in Calder and in the post-minimalist sculptor Richard Serra in one and the same breath suggests that for her, the work of both artists pointed to a similar opening up of sculpture rather than stand as representatives of irreconcilable artistic paradigms. In any case, Tapta's environments converge with that of Oiticica and Pape in other relevant ways. Works like Tent for Chatting and Forms for a Flexible Space are meant, in her own words, and I quote, to create a favorable climate for exchanges between persons and for intimacy, end quote. Likewise, Oiticica's penetrables gradually evolved from structures in which participants would briefly enter or walk through, like in Tropicalia, to large environments like Eden and the Nests, where visitors would linger for protracted periods of time, experiencing a temporality at odds with that of a conventional visit to a museum. As Virginie Mamet has noted, and I quote, the notions of protection and envelopment were common in the descriptions of Tapta's exhibitions. Some people referred to these environments as dens or refuges, spaces into which humans could retreat and feel protected, end quote. For Oiticica, in turn, the very term shelter was a crucial one. He often employed the word in English after the Rolling Stones song Gimme Shelter. In the 1973 text about Lydia Pape's eggs, he proposes the equation egg equals shelter, in order to posit their sheltering as the first stage in a passage from individuality to a state of environmental and communal openness to the world. And what we're seeing here is a photograph of a performance derived from the eggs called Crazy Group Trio, right? So 3 eggs, which are those kind of cubic shapes with fabric or paper, were positioned in this garden in Saterro do Flamengo. It's a modernist garden in Rio, and samba rhythmists entered into them, crouched into them, and then they started playing and ruptured the skin of the object itself and emerged whilst playing their instruments. So the idea is that they entered there as individuals, and with the help of music, they emerged, joined into a kind of collective body. In short, and unlike the upfront tackling of commodity culture advanced by Fluxus and others, Oiticica and Tapta imagined the environmental setting as a kind of shelter in which spontaneous conviviality and deconditioned creative behaviors would have room to thrive and potentially inform other spheres of life. Last but not least, Tapta's and Pape's common interest in teaching should be read against the backdrop of this precise environmental ethos. In their classes, both artists refused conventional classroom hierarchies and worked together with their students in order to stimulate their spatial awareness and foster creativity. Tapta's proposal of, I quote, pushing the students towards a certain poetization of everyday life, end quote, resonates strongly with Pape's fascination with outside spaces, which she referred to as magnetized spaces, where one would, I quote, immediately grasp a whole poetic of its own, end quote. Whereas Tapta involved students in constructing outdoor textile structures, Pape initially refrained from making any interventions during her incursions, as she wanted her anti-classes to suspend the disciplinary constraints that informed her architecture students and thus allow them to engage open-mindedly in, I quote, an exercise of the senses, surprises, and of unusual solutions, end quote. But later, in 1979, she would describe such incursions as the first stage of a larger project and proposed a new development, and I quote, to fill the space with colorful threads, end quote, that would crisscross until they formed a web that somehow registered and visually translated those wandering experiences. Interestingly, Tapta describes her textile environment chromatic tension in a somewhat similar terms, and I quote, my ropes, which crisscross and uncross each other, which cross and uncross each other and go up and down, were designed to be dynamic, due not only to their tension, but also to their colors, end quote. Uncannily, the Japape's choice to rekindle the metaphorical vein of the weavings ultimately led her to synthesize her proposal in a motto that could have literally described Tapta's own experiences. And I finally quote, to weave space. Thank you.